And welcome to this edition of Authors at Alden. I'm Scott Seaman, I'm Dean of Libraries, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you tonight for this latest event. Tonight, we have a conversation between Doug McCabe and Katherine Ziff about Katherine's book, Asylum on the Hill, History of a Healing Landscape. The book, produced in cooperation with the Ohio University Press. Katherine is also a mental health counselor at the Plains Elementary in the Plains near Athens. Asylum on the Hill was published in 2012, so we're just past the one-year anniversary of the publication. And a recent review in the issue of the library magazine Choice said that this is a beautifully written, articulately researched historical work that tells the story of the Athens Lunatic Asylum. It also tells the story of the life and times of patient care in Ohio. Choice awarded its highest recommendation, and it's a real privilege for us to have Katherine with us tonight. I will say that the Ohio University has brought a few copies of the book for sale in the corner back there, and I'm told Katherine will be willing to sign.
Sure, yeah.
For those of you joining on the web, I'd encourage you to get a copy of the book at your local bookseller, or you can just Google Ohio University Press and order it directly from the press's website. Hosting our conversation tonight is Doug McCabe. Doug is Curator of Manuscripts in the Mon Center for Archives and Special Collections here in Alden Library. He's our resident expert on the Athens Asylum. Doug has also put together an extraordinary display of rarely seen archival materials that's just off to the side. If you've not had a chance to see that, please, after the conversation, take a look. We also welcome our online audience as we are webcasting this live with the help of our friends at WOUB Public Media. Thanks as well to everyone at the Ohio University Alumni Association and Office of Event Services for all of their help. Thank you all for coming. And Doug and Katherine, I'll turn it over to you now.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott. And welcome, Katherine, and welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all here, and for everybody on the web as well. What a thrill. This is the first time the Authors at Alden has been done over the web, so we hope that this is an important beginning to webcasting. Wow.
Doug.
Where do we
friend,
start, right? Well, why don't we start with where you're from and what led you on up to Athens? Like, you went to school someplace, you were born somewhere, all those fun things.
Well, I'm from North Carolina and moved here with my family about 15 years ago. This is our 15th year here. And I have various degrees. I have a doctorate from Ohio University here in counselor ed. Also one from Wake Forest in counseling. Before that, a master's degree in public policy, and way back sociology from Chapel Hill. And all those strands of education kind of came together with the focus of the book, actually.
Well, and then you needed to do a dissertation for your doctorate here.
I did.
And that's where this all got started.
That's right.
Where in the world, I was thinking on the way in here tonight, I know I'm weird, and that's why I'm really interested in the asylum and all that kind of thing, but I know you're not weird, and I'm not sure why you got going on it.
Actually, it was my mother's idea. It's my mother's idea. I was thinking, 13 years ago about a dissertation topic. She came up from North Carolina to visit me with my father and couldn't help but notice the asylum up there. And she said, well, why don't you write about that asylum up there on the hill? And that was actually a very good fit, being a mental health counselor and also having studied public policy. In particular, years ago at Virginia Tech, I became interested in the work of sociologist Martin Ryan, who spoke of storytelling and narrative as a way to do public policy analysis. So that's were some strands that really fit for me in beginning this research, which ultimately became a book.
Well, and then you had to figure out where in the world to go looking for stuff.
I
right?
did, and you ask one or two questions, and all roads lead to you, Doug. Right?
Well,
And so I began asking about the asylum, which led to Doug, to you, and to Alden's, the Mann Center for Archives and Special Collections, which, if you don't know, is on the 5th floor and is just a fabulous, fabulous place. Very, probably of a quiet reputation, but a wonderful living archive, I like to think of it. So, and Doug, you told me a very important thing. You're very patient. I know you have a lot of people come and ask you about the asylum. You're very patient, but you said it's a room with 1,000 doors. And I thought, a room with 1,000 doors, meaning by that there are so many ways to study the place, whether time periods, eras, the treatment methods, the people, the psychiatry, the cemeteries, the Civil War. How are you going to narrow it down? And so I narrowed down to the idea of studying the asylum and its interactions, its connections with the community of Athens. But still, there was over 150 years of history, and where do you go to begin to focus? And so what time period? Well, very quickly I had a dream, and sort of being in mental health, you know, I write down my dreams, I take note of them, a little bit of a Jungian strand there, and I dreamt that I was in the attic of the asylum, way up in the attic. Now, I have been in the attic, and it's a very kind of cramped feeling, low ceilings, it's dark, it's dusty, there's small windows, but in the dream attic, I'm in one very spacious room. There were many rooms, but I was in one room. It had high ceilings, polished woodwork, painted walls, big windows you could see outside, but it was full of very old artifacts, antique furniture, old kind of Victorian silver candlesticks, mirrors, all kinds of old artifacts. And so that kind of led me to the idea of studying the asylum at its very beginning years, the 6 or 7 years of construction and formation, and then the 20 years ending in about 1893 of the moral treatment era. So that took me to that. And then you begin to widen again. So you develop research methods. You develop how do you develop categories to study? Because still, even within that time period. So it's a process of making long lists of details from history books, asylum, some of the basic information that's available, and coming up with general topics to begin to study, which then became chapters of a book, chapters of a dissertation. So you collapse all these details into several categories, eventually landscape, architecture, patients and families, business and politics, which kind of go together, and caregivers. So, and from there then, with these categories in hand, you begin to dive into the archives. And that's when the archivists start opening drawers, bringing out boxes, bringing out photographs. And just a word about archivists, Doug, and I want to say also Bill Kimmick and Janet Carlton and Judy and George Bain, who was there earlier, are experts. Archivists anywhere are experts at co-researchers. They're your very best friends in a research project, especially when you're dealing and reading about things where there's no one alive. It's very solitary, so it's really important to have your archivist co-researchers. They're always there. They're always interested in what you're doing. They're always willing to go find a box, bring it out, and also to suggest a resource that you haven't thought of. And they're always happy for you when you make some progress. You find some little snippet that gives you a window into one family's life as related to a patient at the asylum, and it's so exciting because these things are hard to find, and the archivists get excited with you. So very important, the role of not only all the information, but the archivists themselves. So.
Well, and I remember back in those days when you were doing your research, and you'd pull up this and go, look at this. It was new information for me too, and that was really exciting and interesting to pick up on that and then be able to pass that along to other people who are coming in and approaching that 1,000-door room from a different door. because it really is that way. You have all these hundreds, thousand approaches into that one institution. So, yeah, I think one of the important things that you're pointing out, and I think this is very important, is any of us really, whether we're still students or were students, have gone through that process of narrowing it down and narrowing down and narrowing down, tightening things up, so that you can come up with something that makes some sense beyond a third grade book report, that thing.
Yeah.
And
With primary research.
well,
original
right, and that
primary
was,
research.
so, I wanted to ask you, did you find that you turned to secondary sources first, like general histories of asylums in America and things like that, and did that help guide you towards, what at least direction of themes, I would guess?
Yes, actually there was something on every floor of the library that I used. First floor you have microforms, where all the microfilms, and you can go back and read way back the Athens Messenger, if you can, how long you can read those microfilms without getting seasick, back and forth. But there you could read the accounts of the parade that was held when the asylum was, the cornerstone was laid, or you can read about their social gatherings that were held, private parties that were held at the asylum, or the 4th of July celebrations, or if a patient had escaped. So you could read in that, which was sort of popular culture newspapers. And then on the, second floor, we have the cafe and we have the computers, so there's always things to do there. The third floor, fine arts library. If you wanted to look, in some cases I wanted to look back at some of the books, art books that are devoted to art made by patients in asylums across the world. You can go and look at that. Fourth floor, you check out books. Fifth floor is the really heart of all the archives, the Mons Center for Archives and Special Collections, government documents, which have very important source of information about the asylum that anyone can access, and those are the annual reports, where they are long lists of what was purchased, lots of information aggregated about patients, narratives from the superintendents about what was important that year, what they needed from the state, the trustees' reports, staff changes, just huge resource there. And then on the 6th and 7th floors, you have the histories of the Civil War, of Ohio, of the nation, as related to the time period. Medicine, psychiatry, history of psychiatry. If you want to understand about post-traumatic stress disorder and what it might have been called during the Civil War, Soldier's Heart, you could read in the book and get all that kinds of general background. Yeah.
And then
So you have all that.
you found that you needed, for your research, to get into records that are classified as classified.
Because of HIPAA, HIPAA laws still govern very old medical records, which asylum commitment documents are, and the Mons Center holds thousands up to 1913.
Yeah, approximately 1874 to 1913, and then there are some gaps in there too.
Of commitment documents, which would include a decision from the probate court, a narrative from a physician, and sometimes other things put in. And those, you have to either show that you are a direct relative of a patient, or you go through a process of approval from the State Department of Mental Health to show that you're doing research. And then you have access to all those patient records, as well as files which contain things like letters that patients wrote but were confiscated and not mailed, letters that were written to patients, a case book, which is in a library in Columbus and things like that. So then you begin to delve into days and days and days of reading narratives of commitment of patients. I read all the ones. You can look up, there's some cross-reference book, you can look up and find out where people were from. I read all the ones for people from Athens, and then expanded and read, I don't know, 1,000 or more other documents.
Yeah, there's loads of them. Well,
Yeah.
it's the way things were for the Athens Asylum. It covered southeast Ohio. Now that's kind of 18 counties in southeast Ohio. So it could go as far east as Belmont and then as far west as Lawrence County as far north as, I'll say Fairfield County, and then to the Ohio River. But that could change over time. And so some counties would be added and some dropped. And then too, I don't know if you looked at some of these, but there were times when there were transfers of patients from, say, the Columbus Asylum or the Cleveland Asylum, even as far away as Cleveland. I assume that was from
Yes.
overcrowding up in Cleveland.
When the asylum opened, that happened. And also patients were taken from poorhouses, county homes around the state, who had mental illness or were deemed to have that, and they were brought here as well, sometimes on the train in straitjackets.
Right. So the earliest patients, many of them were brought over from Dayton or Cincinnati, where there were already asylums. Columbus already had an asylum, so did Cleveland. Toledo came after the Athens
Longview,
Asylum.
yeah.
But so I think out of 88 counties in the state of Ohio, there's something like, I don't know, 50-some counties represented. Now, some of these counties would only have maybe a couple of patients who might be sent here, but still, and this was done through probate court, so there had to be an application for a person to be sent to the Athens Asylum, meaning that the asylum had the final decision as to whether to accept any patient or not. And one of the things, and I don't know if you looked at these, but we do have some rejected
Yes.
applications.
Yeah, rejected, and they would say rejected, not insane, or sometimes it was very difficult for the staff to figure out how to best care for people with seizure disorders, and they were kind of discouraged and would not accept sometimes people with what they called epilepsy then.
So would you agree that in those first years in particular, and I guess maybe through a good bit of that moral treatment time period, we're not seeing professional psychiatrists or psychologists. We're seeing mostly just regular doctors.
Oh, as far as the commitment goes, it would be a doctor, a physician somewhere in a county, absolutely. Psychiatry was just beginning as a profession, and the asylum superintendents were part of that. But as far as the physicians would go, it would be a regular general practice kind of a physician, making their best guess.
So you would be reliant upon your local county physician to decide whether you were
And what family
insane
and friends came and said to you about you to the court as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right.
Moral treatment. I think most people, and I think myself too for that matter, when I first heard that, so these people are immoral and we're going to turn them into moral people? I mean, it's probably more than that, isn't it? I mean, that's not really all there was to it.
Exactly. It was moral in the sense of humane treatment, and it came from a Quaker-based small asylum that was built in England in the 1790s. William Tuke, the Quaker tea merchant, thought something needed to be done, and he built a small asylum, and it was to feature regular, kind treatment, humane treatment, regular meals, activities were part of the treatment, beautiful views, work and walking outdoors. And this was really a sea change from the earlier assignments when the treatment was relied on very punitive kinds of things, shocking things like a trap door. It was called the bath of surprise. There would be a trap door in the floor, and it would be opened when a patient was walking, and you'd be plunged into cold water with the idea that you could be shocked out of your mental illness. And so this idea of moral treatment was a very big change. Brought to the United States.
And picked up by a Quaker.
Picked up by another Quaker in Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, Kirkbride, hence the Kirkbride architecture. He developed and brought to America codified how this moral treatment should be done, and architecture and landscape were a good part of it.
So it's the architecture, it's the landscape, and then with the architecture, as you can kind of see with the drawing behind us here, most of those windows indicate private rooms. They're probably, about 9 feet by 12 feet or something like that?
They were built small so that the temptation would not be to double people up.
Which was quickly abused, but the idea being that people had private space and private time And then in between, there were day rooms, I guess we might call them now.
Parlors.
Activity rooms, parlors.
And situated to catch the prevailing breeze. If you know the mandala-shaped, the round grill work that's on the windows there was for security, but it was kind of disguised as hopefully something beautiful rather than prison-like bars, although it did serve the same function. Outdoors, walking outdoors was a big
Right,
part
airing.
of it. Airing.
Yeah. And in case any of you are still believing that the lakes out in front were in the shapes of playing card suits, they never were, and you can see some maps over here to show that that's the case. I think it's a matter of transference, because when you look at the bars on the windows, you can spot within the designs 3 out of 4 playing card suits. So, a legend dispelled, right? Okay.
Not there.
Not there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
moral
So,
treatment.
earliest treatments included still these cold baths and hot baths, right?
Right.
But there's just no trapdoor.
No trapdoor. Well, later in the 20th century, there were, the needle showers, the salt wraps, hydrotherapy came into play in the 20th century, electroconvulsive shock therapy, the lobotomy years, all the chapters of psychiatry.
But in those earliest days, it would have been soothing baths.
Soothing baths, taking walks, exercise,
Work, too.
work. The superintendents were always saying we can't make people work, but it really helps them sleep better if they can work. This asylum, the superintendents in the 19th century were leaders in Ohio of the non-restraint movement. So it was very, very, very limited use of physical restraints and chemical restraints, sedatives as well. So they worked very hard to do that. Some patients had the walk of the grounds, others did not. It just depended.
Well, not in the earliest days, I guess, come to think of it, but there were enclosed areas later on, like enclosed courtyards,
Yeah.
so that more excited patients might be able to still get outside.
Move around some.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting to a counselor like myself is that some of these things in the last 20 years have come back into play as a complement to mental health treatment. We know walking outdoors, all kinds of wonderful data coming out now of the benefits of walking outside for depression, for example, the use of art, and so forth. Some of these moral treatment kinds of things are back with us.
Well, and art and indoor plants were very popular at the time as well.
Oh, yeah, there was a greenhouse that kept flowers, supplied throughout the asylum. Walks outside, out through the grounds. And in Japan now, there's a movement called forest bathing, in which we now know with quantitative means that 2 hours of walking in the forest will raise your lower your levels of depression and elevate your mood, all the things that they were doing then kind of as best practice.
Well, and I think you'll be able to see, too, with some of the materials on display, some of the older, a lot of the sepia tone photographs there were taken in the early 1890s when they were very proud of the place at that point because the landscaping had finally matured, and you have, well, we even have a paper about all of the flora and the special plantings that were done all around the asylum, and the special walkways, and you'll see photographs of cascades and falls.
It was an extraordinary landscape, and it still is. It still is. They're vestiges of the old landscape. You can see the old stone spring. There's still apple trees up there. It's still the vestiges of those days. Yeah.
Now, I'd mentioned earlier about no real training for most doctors. What kind of training did attendants have?
At the very beginning, none. And as you could see, as the years went on, the superintendents would write in their annual reports, well, we really need to attend to who we choose to hire to be attendants, how they're trained. And so eventually, by 1911, 1913, we had a nursing school here that trained nurses specifically to work in asylums.
Yeah, we also, again, to plug the display material, excuse me, but it's also to give you some idea all of the different kinds of records that we have in the Mon Center to help when you open any one of those 1,000 doors. We have some employee records, including employment cards. You can leaf through those and see so-and-so lasted 1 day. Other people lasted, you know, weeks, wow, or years for that matter. And then you can also see their pay scale and their pay rates, when they were given raises and that kind of thing.
It was a great place to work. It was a huge bonus for the town of Athens to have the asylum with all the money that was spent in the town to buy everything that was needed. And it was this was during the period of the Long Depression, which was multiple years, decade long. Many businesses were failed. It was very hard times, and so to have a job at the asylum was, you know, a plum job if it agreed with you.
And a place to stay at the asylum.
You lived on site.
How
and
many
you had a
times
salary.
did you read a patient suffering from financial embarrassment, if I remember that one correctly?
Financial embarrassment, yeah.
Yeah.
Worry about a financial loss. Yeah. I was thinking about in the book there are several spots that have the letters and very interesting things that happen to be tucked away in those commitment documents, little treasures. And one was a kind of a window into life, into a family in Ohio. How do you care for a family member who was quite ill? And an elderly man was brought here actually on the first day of spring in the 1880s, and a little note. I found a little handwritten note in pencil from the man's son, and he said, "Father was insane in the first of his sickness. Father was first doctored by Beers for the liver complaint. I think the treatment was a calomel with other medications. Beers being called away and could not attend, we called Dr. Anderson. He doctored him for the liver, kidney, and dropsy. Dr. Leflin said he must die, could not live 2 weeks. Anderson the same. He still continued to swell till his hips and legs, the skin bursted open, and his flesh looked like a cherry red, and he got entirely helpless. I boiled corn and lye and let the steam go to his wounds, and the swelling began to go down. I gave him spicewood tea, which I believe is also the red bud, is another name for the red bud. I gave him spicewood tea to drink, used embrocation oil, and held his wounds, and in 4 weeks he began to walk. Now this gentleman had erysipelas, which is blood poisoning and can lead to hallucinations. So he was weak and he was troubled by hallucinations, and the farmer remained ill. And they did bring him, making a 150-mile journey by wagon with this ill gentleman to bring him here. But just the measures that families would go to try to take care of someone, and then finally saying we've got to get some more help here.
And so many times that you find that example of families working so hard for so long to keep that family member home, and then finally realizing that it just had become too much.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you could find examples of, let's get rid of this family member as quick as possible, and that
They're troublesome.
or I have a trophy wife lined up, and those kinds of things. So as much as we have such a variety of reasons for people to be put in the asylum, and some of them I think we would both agree were extremely questionable, and others...
Oh yeah, how about the
very
coal miner who was trying to start a labor union?
There you go.
Right, soup into the asylum, in Nelsonville.
One of my favorite stories,
Well, there were two reasons. The debate in psychiatry and the history of asylums is, did they come about to provide a social good, to provide humanitarian care, or were they there to provide social control? And the answer is both. You know, we have people who truly had mental illness. We had the coal miner trying to start a labor union. We had a daughter who ran off and joined a brothel in Cincinnati and disgraced the family, and was brought to the asylum. So, women who were truly ill with postpartum depression, brought to the asylum, given some rest, restored, were able to go back to their families. So it's a mix.
And this too, I think, is something important to understand, and that is that many of these people, both the administration and the staff, as well as the families, expected these people who became patients to not be in the asylum for all that terribly long, that they needed asylum.
Yeah.
They needed sanctuary.
The true word of asylum, the true meaning.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, as it
Sanctuary.
turns out, of course, there were a number of people who were there for many years, many decades, became institutionalized, if you will, could not operate or function outside of such a controlled situation.
There was a lot of coming and going when you look at the records also. Someone would get better, go home, relapse, back to the asylum.
Oh, I've seen numerous cases. You can find this in the admissions
Book,
same
same
index
name.
that we have.
Yeah.
Yeah, and oftentimes it'll say RE for readmitted, and some of them are 6 or 7 times. But at the same time, then released so that they could go back, released as quickly as possible. So it's not as if you bring them in and make them stay. Another thing I wanted to ask you about was what was your take on those like Civil War soldiers that you would come across?
Oh, yes. There were, I looked specifically for examples of commitment documents that would indicate that someone was hospitalized because of post-traumatic stress, and indeed they were there. And there were also family members. For example, there were mothers who were there who were just unredeemably depressed because of the loss of the men in their family from the Civil War. So absolutely, we have Civil War veterans buried in the cemetery and who were hospitalized. Some were able to leave, some were not.
No, I don't have any credentials to make this statement really, but my feeling has been for a long time that particularly for those first 20 or so years of the asylum. So the asylum opened in January of 1874.
Yeah.
So that's only a few years after, well, it's not, 9 years after the end of the Civil War, that almost all of the people who were patients there were really veterans of the Civil War, be they
All the
male or
men,
female,
yeah, somehow.
or staff or patients. But the women I'd classify as veterans as well because of their family members having participated in that war.
Yeah.
And
I read of a boy who was 15, and he joined a regiment. He was at Chickamauga, he was at Shiloh, he was all for years, and finally he just gave way under the stress of all that and was hospitalized as soon as the asylum opened. Yeah.
now in the 3 cemeteries that are up there are at least 89 military veterans. They start with the Mexican War and seem to go as far as at least the First World War. And we're finding then that, well, I found in some research I was doing, 2 of them were deserters. So, the stress apparently of the war itself was enough to make them desert even before the end of the war.
Civil War, produced presidents and senators and business leaders, and it also, some people some broke under the stress. So,
And then there's
lot of
Eli
things.
Stevens. Did you look into Eli at all?
read
The-
his
the Confederate-
the document. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a guy who was a Confederate soldier, and imagine what he was in there for what I think 21 years. He was put in the asylum in 1874. Now at that point, everybody else in the asylum are Union people, and either veterans themselves or family members of veterans. I can't imagine that Eli got much sanctuary.
Yeah,
there.
at the asylum. Yeah, and the attendants.
Yeah.
Eli, well, he was hospitalized for. It's thought that he was part of a member of Morgan's Raiders, but we've not really been able to
Yeah, I'm
document
still
that
trying to pin
directly.
that one down,
Yeah,
but-
but he was hospitalized because he burned down a church in was it McCarthy? It's somewhere in Vinton County.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'd have to be crazy to burn down a church, right? Or at least they decided. Well,
Yeah.
well, the trial said he was
Yeah.
guilty and
Yeah,
insane.
and
so,
insane. Yeah.
yeah.
It followed. Yeah.
So then, okay, one of the things that I've talked about with people, and I'm sure you're much more qualified to talk about this than me, is that all of these various treatments weren't designed as tortures by any means. I mean, there was thought behind them that this is going to help people.
You mean with like the The taking the walks or the...
Well, I mean, that, of course, but then, some of the other, like the hydrotherapies,
right,
and then
electroconvulsive shock,
yeah,
lobotomy years.
lobotomies.
Yeah, bad chapters. Well, electroconvulsive ECT therapy is back, but it's much more controlled, and I guess it's used in instances of depression. Lobotomies were shut down after maybe a decade. And the water treatments, some of them sound pleasant, but the needle showers, things like that, had kind of a punitive ring to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So even though there were, intentions were good, these could turn into unfortunate
Well,
treatments.
yeah, I think medicine is psychiatry through 150 years. There are examples here and there. You think of the Tuskegee experiments and so forth. There's all kinds of examples of science gone wrong
Yeah, I've had to wonder.
or medicine gone wrong.
Many of these people are suffering a traumatic shock, which is what brings about the mental distress. And to me, the wonder is, why would you visit shock onto someone who had shock? Wouldn't you go the opposite direction?
Yeah. And then we had deinstitutionalization, and the asylum around the 70s began to be, people were placed in the community. There was a big effort made, social workers and so forth, with all the imperatives, the federal imperatives, to deinstitutionalize. And that coincided with the advent of medications. Thorazine came out, and then so on. And we had the Community Mental Health Care Act, which was an unfunded mandate. And so we have done as best as we can since with combination of small mental hospitals, lots of as much community support as possible, combination of medication and therapy is what we have today.
Jumping back to those early years, those first 20 to 30 years, one of the things we haven't really talked about in any detail, and we're kind of running out of the formal time here, we want to give you all a chance to ask questions or make comments, is the community actions back and forth with the asylum. This is what churches and all kinds of other organizations here in town that had things going on.
Oh, there was lots of interaction with the community, in addition to all the financial exchanges, all the farmers bringing things to sell, the contracts for the milk, the meat, the coal, everything, the light, the gas that kept everything running. There were the pastors from the churches would go up and conduct Sunday services. There was entertainments on Sunday afternoons that the town would be invited to come, and people would go up to the concerts and the picnics and so forth. The grounds themselves were a very permeable boundary between the asylum and the community, and right away the grounds were used for outings, family outings, picnics, Sunday strolls and so forth. And it was just kind of what you did. You went up and took walks, and there were patients there on the ground as well, so there was an exchange.
And very much following that idea of Thomas Kirkbride and the Kirkbride plan, having that buffer, if you will, that's not really a buffer. It's much more of a way for these two communities to have a chance to interact. And we have a photograph over here of people ice skating on the ponds, and I know a lot of people in town went, well, in the region really, there for picnics, and Ohio University students went there to spark and get to know each other along Lover's Lane.
Well, and Athens continues to have, to be an example of a place where mental health, some cutting-edge mental health things are taking place, which the 19th century moral treatment was cutting edge for the times, but we have the diversion program now. We have the crisis training for first responders, and how do you respond to someone who is mentally ill, rather than just something, a criminal activity. So those are really the people here in Athens who have generated those programs have been to Washington and gotten awards for them. So it's a small place with some important things still going on.
Well, and now it's called the Ridges because it was turned over to Ohio University in 1988. I still think of it as a place for mental health. And every time I'm up there, I see dozens and dozens of people up there walking with their
Yes.
dogs or just by
Yes.
themselves, or using the orienteering course, or just enjoying the outdoors, all seasons throughout the year. And it really is
Absolutely.
for mental health.
It
So I
did.
got
Very
the high sign.
restorative. Yeah, very
Yeah,
restorative.
very
yeah.
restorative.
You got the high sign?
I just got the high sign. So let's turn this over to you all. What kind of questions or comments do you have? Yeah.
I'd like to know what period you covered in your book, in your dissertation, and if you ever interviewed anybody that worked there, or patients there, or is it entirely...
The dissertation and most of the book is,
Let Doug
oh,
do this for the web people.
Repeat
Oh.
that for the web people.
Oh.
So what period were you working with as far as your research, and did you interview any patients there, and staff? And staff.
the book and the dissertation focus on the first 20 years. And so, but in the, and then we have, the book also has an epilogue that goes through the rest of the history. And in that process, I did talk to staff, and along the way have met patients as well. And they're cited in the book.
Someone on the webcast.
But that's a project, you know, that needs to be done. There's a lot of oral history that resides, yes.
Okay, Doug.
Someone on the webcast a little bit earlier asked, were there any notable patients that tried to pass themselves off as doctors and or visitors to escape the grounds, presumably, that you know of?
I don't know, but you know, they called them elopements back then, and you would read in the report, we had 5 patients elope, and they just would leave. You would just walk off the grounds. One of them hopped a train and was last heard from working on a plantation off the Mississippi River. But then they would send people out to go try and fetch them back. But I don't know of anyone who, I don't think it was really necessary to go. You could just leave. You could just walk off. Yeah.
And that's another thing, too. The place was never completely
fenced.
enclosed with fencing or anything.
Right.
There was a fence along Richland Avenue, but I think that's much more decorative.
Ornamental,
Yeah,
yeah.
ornamental, yeah.
Yeah.
So famous people escaping, or was that part of the question?
Passing themselves off.
I think,
as
oh,
physicians,
okay.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
as doctors.
Or as doctors or whatever. Well,
Yeah.
There are a couple of cases of doctors who were admitted as patients. Come across that.
A lot of people.
Your hand's higher.
Were there well-known people, or is that something that can't be determined because of the records?
Yeah. I did encounter.
So were there well-known people there?
I did encounter some minor, well-known people, but the terms of my agreement with the state was that there would not be any names or note of that. But nobody rich and famous, just a few local and state notables. Yeah.
Of course, in the
that
modern-
was Billy Milligan, I guess.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the
was out of my
modern
time
era.
period, but there was a whole book, The Lives of Billy Milligan, which you can read. And I would suggest. Yeah.
Someone following up on that online also asked, were there criminally insane inmates or clients or patients there?
People who had committed a crime and were mentally ill. Well, yes.
Yeah, this is certainly, I don't remember when Lima State
Yeah.
Hospital was established, but there are certainly, well, Eli Stevens, one of them we just talked about, was criminally insane, and there were certainly others from Southeast Ohio like that as well. And typically they, I think, would have a little
More
special
security,
attention,
yeah.
higher security.
Rutherford B. Hayes, before he was president, as a young lawyer in Cincinnati, one of his first cases, he prided himself in defending a young woman who had done a crime, but she was also determined to be mentally ill, and he was very pleased about that. His brother-in-law went on to be superintendent at Longview Asylum, and he visited here several times, this asylum. He was very closely aligned with that. Yeah.
Were there African Americans? Someone online wonders there?
Yes, yes.
Hundreds.
We know that it's in many asylums and in many locations, African Americans were segregated in the asylums or separate asylums were built. We don't really know geographically within this asylum how that took place, but there were lots.
There were lots, and I've never seen anything that actually says that they were segregated. So I'm making the assumption, fair it may not be, but making the assumption that they were not segregated. When you look at photographs of staff, there are a few
African-American
African Americans,
staff.
whether they were strictly to care for other African Americans or not, I don't know. I can tell you this, because I have seen, plenty of evidence to this, that there is no segregation in any of the 3 cemeteries up there.
That's right.
As a matter of fact, this Eli Johnson, the Confederate, is buried up there, and right next to him is a Union soldier who was in the 21st United States Colored Infantry. So I think Israel
Fitting.
Johnson was buried there specifically to keep an eye on Eli.
Keep that in
for
check.
eternity,
Yeah.
maybe. There was a question right here.
When and under what circumstances did all these materials come to Ohio University?
When and under what circumstances did all these materials come to Ohio University, to the Mon
archives.
Center?
I don't know, for sure. I think most of the materials came between 1988 and the early 1990s. It was before I got here, so I didn't witness some of that. But those committal papers we were talking about, a lot of the old photographs that we have here, some of the superintendent's material, which would be superintendent's correspondence, administrative documents, including like the employee records, the payrolls, all those things came directly from the asylum. We like to make noise about that, but we also like to keep it quiet because I think Ohio Historical Society thinks that they really own them. and technically, the Ohio Department of Mental Health does own those records. I mean, we don't own them. They are basically on deposit here. And then we've added things off and on over the years, or even in some cases created some things specifically to just complement the collections we have here. There's one in the back, and then we'll get to you. Yes, sir.
What's your biggest hope and biggest fear for conservation in the future on the site?
Biggest hope and biggest fear for conservation, preservation of the material?
Of the documents or
Or the
the
site.
ridges itself?
The ridges itself.
Okay, you want to go first on that
Sure.
hot topic?
One of the things that I don't hear about much in all the discussion that has we suddenly have are the grounds, which are, when you read the descriptions of them, they're a kind of a rare example of some of the most beautiful and varied grounds, natural states here in the county. There are old fields, there are meadows, there are old forests, some very, very old trees, and we don't hear much about what will become of the grounds. And they're enjoyed by many, many people as a restorative place to visit and walk and exercise and socialize. So and they were a major part of the history here, where the farms were, their vestiges of the orchards and so forth. So I would love to see some of the concern about those grounds and preserving them as they are, or even enhancing a little bit, tending them, take place. Then there are the buildings. If you look at the master plan, it calls for preservation of the Kennedy and one wing out from there, as well as the buildings that have been renovated, which are the old cottages, the cottage style that were built, where the Voinovich Center is now. And then the rest would be converted to parking, a new stair-step building that would go down where Building 20 is now. So there does stand a master plan that was approved a few years ago.
Someone online asked if any of these records have been digitized or if they've been computerized and cataloged, that sort of thing.
I'll say one thing. I do know when I was at the State Library of Ohio that they are some years ago, began a process of digitizing all the annual reports of all the asylums. That'll be fabulous when that happens, but it's not done
Yay.
yet.
Yeah. Then we won't have to.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't have a whole lot of annual reports anyway, but I think those are really great resources. As far as what we're doing with things, we cannot digitize the committal papers because they are confidential by state law. So why bother digitizing them if nobody can, or very few people can really look at them? I should mention with that, though, that there is now a process where if people learn that they have an ancestor who was in the asylum and can fill out some paperwork that we will provide for them to fill out, and then we can release to them copies of those committal papers if we have them. So that's become something very helpful to a lot of people who are doing genealogy, but also for people who have concerns about perhaps genetic disorders within their family. And unfortunately, they're not going to learn much from these papers because something that says severe melancholia, well, what does that really mean today? I mean, it has a meaning. It just has an updated term for it, but it's not really. So we don't have patient records. We have these committal papers, and frankly, a lot of those can be accessed in any of the counties in the state. Yeah.
What has been digitized are there are a lot of images. If you go to the digital collections of Alden Library, there are many, especially the old, the 1893 set that went to the World's Fair, the photographs of the grounds, those have been digitized and are available online.
Right. So we have to also then be careful about digitizing anything else that would mention a patient's name. In that process, if we decided to try to digitize some of those records, we would have to redact all of those names out of there. It's very labor intensive, so therefore very expensive to do. So the chances of us doing a whole lot there in digitizing records is relatively slim. I can say this, though, that we are working this year, one of sort of my main focuses is to help put together some websites. One website will very specifically look at the cemeteries. I've spent some years now identifying all of the people buried in all of those cemeteries, even the 1,700 plus people who are buried under just numbers. And then we're also talking about a much bigger picture of doing a massive website on the entire complex so that you could zoom in on a certain building and click on it, bring up pictures, bring up whatever other kinds of records we might have about that building. So this is going to be a long-term project, but I'm really looking forward to it. Yes, Charlie.
Well, only thing I
Oh,
was going to
sorry.
say is I was a department head there when this hospital closed, and I had in my office, third floor, there on the left,
Oh, here.
had a lot of artifacts that I meant to take to, and it was closed down to us almost immediately. I think there was discussion about whether the Department of Mental Health, the Historical Society, and so forth were going to, but I couldn't take even bookcases and things like that that I'd had there for years, and thought that I could just transfer to my new office. So they preserved that stuff almost immediately, not knowing what they were going to do with it or anything like that, but they didn't let it walk out of there.
Yeah.
Or at least not hospital employees. There was some discussion about OU employees walking off with artifacts out of there, but not hospital.
There was an auction at one point, I think, in the 70s maybe, of a lot of the things too. So.
Yeah. And I'm always, we are always interested in records. Now, artifacts, pieces of furniture and so forth, that's a little beyond what we as an archive are really all about. But records, kinds of things, photographs, all that kind of stuff. So if
I had a lot of photographs on my walls in my office.
so, you need to find out where they are now so we can get a hold of them.
Probably in the OU president's office.
That could be.
I
Okay.
hope you have them. I hope you have them.
We might. Well, take a look. I have a lot of them out there. Charlie.
Yeah. My name is Charles Murray Rose. I'm the grandson of Dr. Charles Harry Creed. He was a superintendent at the State Asylum. And one thing I'd like to say to Katherine, I've said this to her over the telephone, but I'd like to publicly thank her. She made a very nice reference in the book about my grandmother, Marcella Harding Creed. She was famous for being such a compassionate woman, and she would have birthday parties for the patients. And she was talking about myths to dispel and earlier in her talk. And one thing that I know was true, they used to have an alligator in a fountain in front of the main building, and kept it in water, a circular fountain. And in the wintertime, when it was too cold to have it out for the patients to be entertained by it would be put in the basement. And I just wish that Dennis Powell was here tonight. He wrote a rather scathing thing in the Athens News, and believe me, this place needs to be preserved. It's a treasure, and I'm just sorry that the younger people just don't realize, what a great place it was. Thank you.
Welcome. There's a picture of the alligator and also a picture of where they kept the alligator in the wintertime, right over here. So.
I was wondering if you had an opinion on the recent demolition of Building 26 and how you think that impacts the history.
Well,
An opinion on the recent demolition of Building 26.
Well, what's done is done. It's gone. Though it's not gone entirely, I hike up there a lot and learned that all the masonry and tile and concrete have been ground up and spread on the road that leads up to Radar Hill. So when you go walk up there now, we're walking on those remnants of Building 26. Well, the more buildings that are taken down, the more you lose the very unique resource that is here, which is a 150-year record of the history of psychiatry through its architecture. You have the moral treatment, you have the cottage style, you have the all the way up to the 1950s and the 1960s. So you just have less and less of a complete, complete historical perspective on the ground. Hardly anywhere else in the United States is such a complete and taken care of facility. One of these hospitals exist. The Kirkbride hospitals were built in just about every state of the Union, probably close to 100 of them across the United States.
Many of these, it is sad to see some buildings torn down. At the same time, think about the challenge that the university or the community has in trying to preserve the buildings and the grounds, for that matter. It takes money, and it takes lots and lots of money. And it takes purpose, too. You have to have some reason to do something with those buildings.
They're the original construction was very hardy. I've been told it will probably last another 150 years, but it's very expensive to renovate.
Right.
All the load-bearing walls so close together, very.
Well, go up there to the Kennedy Museum and look at the depth of the window sills, like that. Okay, well, we're going to need to bring this up to code, so let's drill holes through here to put in new electric, and you have to have a drill bit at least this long and pay some crew of people. It'd take months to do all that. Yeah.
I was part of discussions at the time as to whether to renovate the hospital or whether a new hospital would be built, and it was really prohibitively expensive to even thought about renovating that hospital and bringing it. But that was the first thing that was discussed, was to preserve it and to renovate it, that just.
Thinking of all the code standards, it must have been just.
Well, there was
asbestos. There's lead.
And it just wasn't possible to do that, so the new hospital got built.
Now, at the same time, I don't want anybody to think that I'm, advocating, knock the whole place down. I think that
It's
it
not an
really
easy
ought to
question.
be
Not an easy
preserved as
question.
much as possible, or as best as possible. But until you can have utility for those buildings, what are you going to do with them?
And money, yeah.
And the money to do it, then you just have to mothball them. And that's what the university has been forced to do for many years with a lot of those buildings.
And done a beautiful job with the Kennedy and the Memorial Auditorium and the Voinovich Center buildings.
Although I saw a really big hole in the roof when I was up there last week giving a tour. So,
Did you really?
Yeah, it's a big one.
I heard about that.
It's like the size of a king-size mattress or something. I mean, it's. So let's all
bad.
chip in and get some blue tarps, or whatever, because it really is a treasure, and that's the buildings. But I think your point is very well taken. That's 740 plus acres up there that was turned over to Ohio University. doubling the size of the university here in Athens. 'Cause 700 some acres here on the main campus and now out there as well. And while there are things going on out there like the orienteering and the land labs and a lot of other things, there's a lot of other things that could be done and a lot of other projects that could be done. Simple, easy, cheap, by students, student organizations, student groups, and community people as well. It would help at least preserve the ground.
Maintain the trails and. all
Yeah,
that
maintaining
stuff.
trails and all of that kind of thing. I can't emphasize this enough. It is a wonderful place for your own mental health, just to go up there and wander around. And I see faces I know do that, so.
If you go to Cemetery 1, there's always a well-supplied set of brochures that mark the walks, the different walks that are up there. So you could just get a brochure and take a 30-minute or an hour or a 2-hour walk up
So
there.
you can still go up there and spark.
So we have another question from our webcast. Someone is wondering if you give tours, if someone gives tours of the grounds occasionally?
Yeah, I'm available for tours. I think
Tom Walker gives
Tom
tours.
Walker,
You can
astronomer.
contact Tom Walker through
George Eberts gives
George
tours.
Ebert.
Yeah.
George Ebert is an employee here at Ohio University. Tom Walker is a retired political science professor. Probably the easiest way to contact him would be through the Athens chapter of NAMI, the National Alliance
for
the
mental illness.
for the mentally ill.
For mental illness, yeah.
Or for mental illness, okay. And that could be Googled very easily, and you can find Tom's name. I've given tours. I'm not sure who else.
I'll do one if there's some people I've done for third graders or
Yeah.
middle school kids. You can tailor it to however.
Well,
yeah.
and we've done, the Ohio University Alumni Association sponsors hay rides
Homecoming.
at homecoming, and Katherine and I and George and Tom have been the tour guides for those.
You can go
things.
through the Historical Society. George will do tours. Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay, good. So, yeah, there are tours. The last one I gave was last week, and that was 2.5 hours. I don't know if you really want me all the time. Although they said they liked it, so let's hope that they did.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
When the Ridges was built, was there already a system of institutions or facilities for mentally retarded citizens whose families could no longer take care of them?
Were there facilities for the mentally retarded as well?
At that time, no. Well, very soon there was, in Columbus, there was an institution for what was called then the feeble-minded. But as far as when I read the records and the case admissions documents, it appeared that this asylum here was also a place where people were admitted, developmental disabilities.
And that could include, like you mentioned earlier, epilepsy, the very first female patient.
She was 11-year-old child with epilepsy.
Did you hear that? 11-year-old child.
Little girl, yeah.
Anybody else?
Yes.
I have heard that there was a farm associated with the asylum, and that was part of the therapy
Yeah.
that the people participated in.
Very quickly, the asylum leadership decided to start a farm, and it grew and grew and grew. By the 1950s, in the annual reports, you would read and say we have 3 main purposes: to take care of our patients, to give advice to people who are not our patients, and our agricultural enterprise. There was just a really well-developed, robust agricultural enterprise. Vegetables, fruits, the beef cattle, the piggery, poultry, milk, you name
Dairy
it.
operation.
The dairy operation, yes. This is
Dairy
this is the dairy barn. This is the 100th.
Self-sustaining.
It wasn't entirely self-sustaining because you could see that where they were still having to buy some things, and also they would trade if, say, the asylum in Columbus had extra potatoes and there were more apples here, that they would swap back and forth. So there was a really large agricultural enterprise.
Yeah, I think what you-
Patients worked there, staff worked
Right.
there.
What you see is there's an evolution with treatments and an evolution with training of people and so forth. There's also an evolution within the asylum as its whether it can be self-sustaining or not. It never really was fully self-sustaining. And it would ebb and flow as to how much they could produce on their own.
If it was a bad year for tomatoes, well, you'd have to.
Right, yeah. And in the very beginning, they didn't really have a power plant, and then they were buying power from here in Athens. They were buying milk and eggs and all that other kind of thing. So, and really, the businesses around town found that to be extremely important, including the local stationery store and all of those kinds of things. So there was quite a back and forth going. Now it was up until like the early 1960s. That asylum was the largest employer in all of Athens County, and was only eclipsed by Ohio University by the mid-1960s. So it was really the most important institution devoted to the mind in this area. This place was of secondary importance for most of the existence of the asylum, or most of the existence of this university, for that matter.
That's right.
We are going to archive the video for this, and we'll have it on our website within a few days, so you can recommend this to other folks if they're interested, and all of our guests online as well. If you're interested in some of the special collections at Alden Library, we have some brochures on a table over here, and you're more than welcome to have these. Some interesting things here in Athens at Alden Library and the Mon Center. Katherine Ziff, Doug McCabe, thank you very much for being with us on Authors at Alden.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.